Welcome to the second part of this three-part examination of the rise of Shiism and the Shia Crescent in the Middle East. I'm Ethan Bronner, I'm the Deputy Foreign Editor of The Times, and we have three terrific speakers today for this next hour. Again, a quick reminder to turn off your various electronic devices and to remember that today's session is on the record. And that when we get to the Q&A, to please wait for the microphone and to identify yourself when you ask. We'll do this for about a half an hour, 40 minutes, and then I'll ask you to participate. The speakers, as I think you know, are Steve Cook from the Council on Foreign Relations, Toby Jones, who's from Swarthmore, and used to be with the International Crisis Group, and Ray Tayek, who's with also the Council on Foreign Relations. So our topic today is the rise of Shia power. Is Shia power a cause of concern to the United States? And clearly the answer must be to some extent yes, because that's why we're all here. It does seem clear that suddenly when the United States' focus in Iraq became Najaf, and American officials visiting Najaf and trying to somehow get an audience with Sistani and Sistani-related people certainly must have suddenly asked themselves what exactly they'd gotten themselves into when they looked at the sort of medieval quality of Najaf. I haven't been in some years, but it is certainly in no better shape than when I was there. And it doesn't necessarily feel like the place that Jeffersonian democracy is going to arise from. On the other hand, if there is to be any kind of change in the political nature of Iraq, it's clearly going to be, this is the bosom of where it's going to come from, given the relative focus of Shiism and of power in the country. Vali Nasser says in this forthcoming Foreign Affairs article that the Middle East that will emerge from the crucible of the Iraq War may not be more democratic, but it will definitely be more Shiite. And it may also be, and that'll be one of the questions we'll try to address in the next hour, more Iranian. Therein, I think, lies a kind of paradox for American policymakers, and that is that the more they are pushing for democracy, the more rights that means for minorities like Shiites, and that may mean more influence for Iran, which at the moment doesn't exactly feel like America's best friend. So, is this a cause for concern? Yitzhak Nakash has a new book out that says, he says in his book that the Shia in the Middle East, including Lebanon and Iran, have actually moved, he says, from violence to accommodation. And he describes the current moment as a post-Khomeini stage. And he says that Sistani and the quietist tradition believe in a state run by politicians, not imams. And that Sistani and Sistani.org are increasingly the focus of Shiite and Shia attention in the region, including within Iran, he says. So we're going to get our conversation started. I'm going to ask each of you to briefly address the question of the panel, which is that is the rise of Shiism a cause of concern to the U.S.? And I'll just ask Stephen to start.
Sure. Thanks very much, Ethan. On a number of levels, I think yes, but not because the United States should see Shiism as a religion, as a sect, as a threat in and of itself. It strikes me that on a number of other levels, though, it is a cause for concern for the United States. First, as you mentioned, is this question of Iran. What essentially U.S. policy has done in the Gulf is help create this Iranian moment. And as you quite rightly said, Iran doesn't feel exactly like the United States' best friend right now. We have a number of outstanding issues with the Iranians. And to the extent that the rise of Shia consciousness and Shia political power provides Iran more of an arena to play in Persian Gulf politics, it's going to be a cause for concern for the United States. The second level is what the kinds of things that the rise of Shia political consciousness and political power will do in places like Bahrain, where the U.S. Fifth Fleet is based, in the eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia, the major oil-producing places, in South Lebanon. What do these things do to the domestic politics to those countries? And then how does the United States craft a new policy to deal with these countries? And even in places where there aren't large Shia populations, in places like Egypt, there's tremendous concern about the rise of Shia power which is a corollary to this emphasis on democracy in the region, so that regimes may, in fact, instead of pursuing reform and more democratic openings, they may do other things. And we've seen quite a bit of that over the course of the last few months.
Is it a cause for concern? It is. I mean, as I think Steve pointed out, it's an issue that touches on a number of different places geographically. In spite of the complexity within Shiism that we talked about this morning, there is the potential for Shias to think as a community. And I think Vali Nasser talks about that in his essay as well. And to see themselves as a community for a number of historical and political reasons. But is Shiism a cause? Is it a threat to U.S. interests? It's not now. It could be. It doesn't necessarily have to be. I mean, a lot depends on how things shake out in Iraq, but also how the U.S. pursues its regional interests and its policy, both in the Middle East and South Asia. I don't think it's necessarily uncertain. I think the Shia in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and elsewhere in the Gulf, for example, don't necessarily harbor the same anti-Western, anti-American sentiment that they did at one time. They pursue a decidedly nationalist policy for the most part. They seek integration and accommodation, as Steve also mentioned. So for the moment, things are okay, but I think also because reform has struggled, democratization has not really taken root, obviously, that a lot of these things are uncertain, and an ideologue or some other kind of charismatic figure or political movement can certainly come up that could disrupt all of that and lead it in another direction. We've seen that before historically. So for the moment, I think things are okay, but I think, as in all cases in the Middle East, things are uncertain 5 years down the road.
I suppose I'm the odd man out because I don't think so. I just did it as a point of diversity in the panel. There's too much agreement. First of all, a couple of things. Increasingly, whenever the last moment when this issue came about, whether the rise of Shiism is necessarily a danger to American security policy and incumbent regimes, was in 1979, 1980, when Islamic Revolution appeared awesome and ferocious and unrelenting. And at that time, what you saw is the local Shia communities, whether in Saudi Arabia or Bahrain and others, Kuwait, utilized the Iranian threat or the perception of the Iranian threat to try to renegotiate the national compact in their individual countries, try to become more integrated in the Kuwait-Saudi political and economic life. So in that sense, they weren't so much trying to become subsidiaries of Iran, but trying to use the specter of Iran as to try to have a different relationship with the Sunni regimes that they ruled. That they were ruled by. Now, when people say, well, is the rise of Shiism a threat, they're not particularly talking about Bahrain, but they're talking about Iraq. Namely, whether the new Iraq, or at least segments of it, are going to be sort of an adjunct of the expanding Iranian empire. I hear this a lot from the Sunni leadership, from the Sunni papers. You just don't hear that much of it from the Iranians or, frankly, the Iraqis, Shiites, who are not inclined to become subsidiaries of anybody. I think the principal policy that Iran has in Iraq is not necessarily promotion of the Shia community, but prevention of Sunni domination of Iraqi politics. By definition, that becomes promotion of the Shia community. And not so much because they think the Shia community will act as their agents or subsidiary of their power, but simply because they recognize that Shia community in Iraq has had a different international orientation than the Sunni community. Sunni community tried to justify its monopoly of power by embracing an aggressive transnational ideology, pan-Arabism. In case of Shia community, they also have a foreign policy identity and orientation, one that calls for improvement of relations with Iraq's non-Arab neighbors. Now that includes Iran, that includes Turkey. So in that sense, they're much more likely to live at peace with Iran. That's good for Iran. That's good for Iraq, but I will say that's good for the United States. One of the principal problems that has happened in the past 30 years in the Middle East, at least in the Gulf, has been friction and tension between Iran and Iraq. If somehow those tensions are ameliorated or it is evaporated, I'm not quite sure a more stable Gulf is necessarily a proposition that's against long-term American security.
Ray, let me ask you to respond to what Nakash said, the quote that I read when I opened the thing, in which he said that actually Iran is in a not very aggressive stage right now. Now, he wrote it obviously a year ago, otherwise, that's how long it takes for a book to come out. And I want to know whether you think that that is now outdated, or you still think that's true, given what we hear from President Ahmadinejad.
Iran is not a revisionist power like it was in the early 1980s when they were talking about, Bahrain as just another province of Iran. It's not a revisionist power. It's a status quo power with incendiary rhetoric. And if you look at the rhetoric of the Iranian regime, it actually does not suggest any changes in terms of the policy in the Gulf from the previous government. The incendiary rhetoric tends to focus a great deal on Israel and the United States. And that's partly the reason the way Iran has always tried to overcome the sectarian divide in the Middle East and become a larger Middle Eastern power is by using those two issues. Because otherwise, if it's cast exclusively as a Shi'i power, then by implication, its regional influence is limited. However, if it's cast as an anti-Israeli state and as one that resists American encroachment in the Middle East, then potentially it could have an appeal to a wider Arab street, Egypt.
But to what end? To what end?
In terms of having a larger influence in terms of deliberations in the region, in terms of what happens in the Israeli-Palestinian, what happens in Lebanon, and so on. And having a voice on the councils of power.
Okay, I don't want to spend... Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to respond to something that Ray said. If we take your argument at face value that it is not an aggressive power, it's not a revisionist power, it has shifted its rhetoric on places like Bahrain, that doesn't necessarily make a difference in terms of, for example, Bahraini politics, in which Bahraini leadership, the Sunni-dominated Bahraini leadership, the way it relates to the United States about the concerns it has about its own stability and the stability of the region, and then how the United States responds to that. Clearly, throughout the Gulf and beyond, there is an effort on the part of Arab elites to use the specter of a Shia crescent, as King Abdullah remarked, for their own political purposes, and the fact that we can say that the Iranians have tremendous influence, regardless of whether they're status quo, revisionist power or not, has an effect on the elite with whom the United States continues to work, with whom they continue to work with, and their own perception of threat.
I mean, the thing is, there are all sorts of problems. One is, what are American interests? Okay, in other words, if the rise of Shiites creates some instability in places like Bahrain or in Lebanon and other places, but lead to greater democracy, is that an American interest? That's one question. And then, of course, the other question is, can you separate out what happens internally, Shiite-Sunni issues, from what Iran is doing or might do? So I'm going to ask us to try to slice those so that they don't become all conflated. Toby, is American interest served by greater Shiite expression of power in some of these countries?
Well, if its primary interest is in the maintenance of stability in the region, then absolutely it's served by sort of altering the nature of power and the Sunni regimes that dominate. That, by the nature of their rule, they're provocative, they're incendiary, they're the people that in fact alive. I mean, it's the Sunni governments, the Al Khalifa and the Al Saud and the others who keep alive the Islamic revolution. It's not the Shia communities that continue to maintain their grip on Khomeini as a symbolic figure. It's people like the